This is the story of UTA Flight 141. By the way, UTA stands for Union des Transports Africains, not to be confused with the French carrier UTA. UTA was an airline that flew in Africa and the Middle East. Flight 141 was one of the flights that they operated. Flight 141 was flown by a Boeing 727, and the route was long. Flight 141 would start in Conakry International Airport in Guinea. From there, it would fly to Cotonou in Benin, and from there, it would head to Beirut before finally ending up in Dubai. On Christmas Day 2003, a 727 was making this weekly trip and was at Cotonou International Airport in Benin. But before the plane even left the ground, things were off to a bad start. Passenger boarding wasn't going that well. There seemed to be a great deal of confusion. It was chaotic, making it harder for the cabin crew. Everyone seemed to have a lot of cabin baggage, and there seemed to be nowhere to put all of that baggage. It was the same thing in the cargo holds. By the time the cargo handlers were done, the cargo holds were full. Once the chaos had been dealt with, the pilots started working on the calculations for their flight to Kufra. Kufra was an airport in Libya. It was a stopover on their way to Beirut. The first officer talked to the UTA executives in the cockpit about their weight limits on the plane, while the captain handled ATC communications. As they carried out their checks, the plane's fuel tanks were topped off with 11.4 tons or 25,000 pounds of fuel. The captain, now having finished his work, set the flaps to 25 and turned off the AC units in preparation for takeoff. The first officer taxied the plane to the runway, and at 1:52 p.m. on Christmas Day 2003, Flight 141 lined up for takeoff. The pilots knew that this takeoff would need every ounce of performance that the plane had. On the runway, they applied their brakes and ramped the engines up to full power. After takeoff, they'd climb at a steady 3 degrees to gain speed. With that, they started rolling down the runway. At the start of the takeoff roll, there were some people who were still standing in the cabin, but they sat down once the plane was underway. As the plane picked up speed, the controller in the tower noticed that Flight 141 was taking quite a bit of time to get airborne. In the cockpit, the captain saw that the plane had reached 137 knots, their rotate speed. The first officer pulled back on the yoke to take the 727 into the sky. But nothing happened. They were still on the ground. The captain called, "Rotate, rotate," and the first officer pulled back even harder. Slowly, the nose of the 727 began to rise into the air. But Flight 141 had run out of space. It had just taken off, but it could not clear a concrete building on the extended center line of the runway that housed the localizer antenna. The right landing gear impacted the building and was ripped off. The plane banked slightly to the right, and it came crashing down on a beach just beyond the runway. Most of the wreckage continued on till it ended up in the ocean. Of the 163 passengers on board, only 22 survived. Unfortunately, 2 people on the ground were also killed. Right after a crash, an investigative agency's GO team is put into action. The GO team has multiple sub-teams. Some teams survey the crash site, some people talk with eyewitnesses, some others gather records and files pertaining to the accident airplane, should the investigation need them. So, in this fashion, the investigators asked UTA Airlines for the weight and balance sheet of Flight 141. There are usually 2 copies of this document. One is given to the pilots, and the other is kept by the airline. But strangely, UTA had no copies of the weight and balance sheets for the accident airplane. Okay, that's weird. So they asked for the weight and balance sheet for the first flight on the 25th of December. They did not have that either. Shockingly, this airline had no documents pertaining to the accident airplane. No weight and balance sheets, no loading plans, no nothing. You might be thinking to yourself right now, he's got to be exaggerating. Well, here's a direct quote from the report. Quote, "In general, the operator was unable to supply any documents relating to the airplane's previous flights." End quote. After some hunting, a representative of the Lebanese government found a few documents about the plane. They found 6 weight and balance sheets for previous flights of the accident airplane. Strangely, these weight and balance sheets were filled out on a paper with the letterhead of another airline called Alpha Omega Airlines. So, on the day of the accident, a representative of UTA gave the captain the loading information of the plane and he calculated the weight and balance of the plane. Since the investigators had next to nothing to go off of, they had to calculate the weight of the plane at takeoff. For this, they took the empty weight of the plane from a database in the US. Then they had to approximate the weight of the luggage, and they had no idea how much luggage each person was carrying. That figure is hard to pin down, and it varied a lot from passenger to passenger. The investigators finally came up with a figure for the takeoff weight of the airplane: 85 tons, give or take half a ton. The crew thought that the plane weighed 78 tons, but in actuality, the plane was several tons heavier. Now, you might be thinking that the mystery of Flight 141 has been solved, but not so fast. The investigators sent the data to the engineers at Boeing. They crunched the numbers and came to the conclusion that even at 86 tons, the plane should have been able to take off and clear the concrete building at the end of the runway. Something else was at play here. The data showed that on the day of the accident, the nose was too slow to lift off. To understand why, we need to understand the forces acting on a plane as it takes off. The weight of the plane acts downwards, and the lift generated by the wings act upwards. The horizontal stabilizers at the back of the plane produce a downwards force that lifts the nose up. For the nose to rotate on takeoff, the horizontal stabilizer needs to be set up at a particular setting so that it provides enough downforce at the back to lift the nose up. On the accident airplane, the horizontal stabilizer was set to 6 3/4, but for some reason, that was not enough. The investigators looked at the center of gravity of the plane. Think of the center of gravity as the point around which the mass of the plane is concentrated. The center of gravity is very important for a plane to get airborne. It has to be within bounds. But on the accident plane, the center of gravity was a bit forward than usual. That is, the weight and balance of the plane was off from what the pilots expected. The center of gravity for a normal takeoff is 19%, whereas for this takeoff, it was 14. The forward section of the plane was heavier than expected. This explained the slow rotation of the nose and the crash. Had the pilot set the horizontal stabilizer to 7 3/4 and not 6 3/4, the plane would have been able to take off, no problem. So why didn't they? Why did they make such a small but crucial mistake? In short, they didn't know. The airline did not tell them how the weight was distributed throughout the plane. You cannot calculate the center of gravity without that info. So they defaulted to the 6 3/4 because that's always what they use for takeoffs. In addition to that, they were in a high stress environment. The boarding was chaotic and they were under a lot of stress to depart on time and to complete this flight. In addition to that, they thought that they had a margin of 5 tons, which they did not have. Lastly, they thought that the plane would make it because it always did before, but on this occasion, it did not. This sealed their fate. This is where a usual video would end, but the investigators found some really interesting things about the airline, so let's dig into that. The airline primarily operated small planes like the Antonov 32 and the Let 410. They onboarded the 727 with basically no preparation on their part. For example, there was no additional training for the pilots, and there was basically no flight safety structure at the airline for a 727. But the problems at the airline went deeper, or in this case, higher. They found that the majority of the management posts at UTA were filled with members of one family, and they basically had no aviation experience. Other people, like technical directors and the chief pilot, had no experience dealing with an airplane as large as the 727. But it gets worse. Take the operations manual, for example. It was hastily copied and pasted from other documents. In some cases, they didn't even bother changing the name of the country to Guinea. The airline basically wrote an operations manual the same way a teenager writes a book report at the last minute by copying and pasting from random documents. Keep in mind, that's one of the documents that they were able to produce. The airline had no documents on how a plane should be loaded or documents about the calculation of weight and balance for the 727. To no one's surprise, it got worse. The operations manual specified the departments that were present at the airline. For example, a section dispatcher, a navigational section, a systems and procedures section, a crew scheduling section, and a record section. None of these departments actually existed at the airline. This airline was not ready to operate a 727. On the Wikipedia page for this crash, the summary says, failure to take off due to aircraft overload as a result of pilot error. Do you agree with that? This was technically pilot error. The pilots did not set the horizontal stabilizer correctly, but they were being overworked and they were not given the information that they needed to fly this plane safely, all while being in a stressful work environment. These pilots probably would have quit in a few months, as this airline had gone through 3 separate crews over the span of a few months. So, what do you think? Do you think the pilots are to blame, or does all fault rest with the airline? Let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.